Theories of International Relations. Part 2. Topic: Realism. Hans Morgenthau explained international politics as international politics, like all politics, is a struggle for power. Aims of the learning. 1. Locate realism as a branch of the theory of international relations (IR). 2. The anarchic international structure will be introduced as the organizing principle of realism. 3. Compare classical realism and structural realism core concepts. 4. Apply realist principles to examine First World War causes and consequences. At the end of this topic you would be able to 1. Describe and discuss core principles and terms related to realism. 2. The security dilemma is described as a cause of conflict between states. 3. Compare realist IR theories with English school theories and liberal institutionalism. 4. Use realist ideas to explain the reasons behind the First World War. Topic summary. 1. Realist philosophy first gained attention in the United States at the conclusion of World War II and attempts to explain the recent nature of war. 2. Realism's guiding principle is the anarchic international system, a collection of sovereign states whose actions are limited only by power rather than by the institutions of English schools or liberal regimes. 3. Realism provides a highly simplified model of international behavior, discussing the nature of conflict but not addressing many other facets of the IR. 4. All realists agree on three core ideas: statism, survival, and self-help. 5. Classical realists ascribe war to our flawed human nature. 6. Structural realists relate war to what they see as our rational response to the security dilemma that the anarchic international system in which we live produces. 7. During the Cold War, U.S. realists advocated a containment strategy in which the U.S. strengthened and supported anti-communist states. 8. This was explained by the dual moral standard, in which the actions of a state at the international level are not subject to the same ideas of right and wrong as actions taken at home. 9. In the international system, when balancing against the power of another actor, a state can balance internally by developing its own power or externally by allying with other actors. 10. Structural realism shows us that the First World War began thanks to the security dilemma, which meant that similar policies in the others had to echo any investments made in armaments by one state. 11. The great powers of Europe established a pair of competing alliances to avoid war, which in fact made it easier for conflict to spread from the borders of Serbia and Austria-Hungary to every corner of the continent, in order to balance one another. Introduction. Realism is the name given to a collection of post-World War II theories that emerged in the U.S. Realists, like Thomas Hobbes, believe that anarchy is an inherently unstable condition that requires international actors to guarantee their own survival through power accumulation. Therefore, the pursuit of power is a primary objective of realist theory insofar as it allows states to ensure their survival in a world where an international actor's life tends to be solitary, poor, nasty, violent, and short. You can recall the argument of Hobbes that a society without a hegemon to enforce order will be inherently unstable because any person can kill anyone else in it. Realists are applying this piece of political theory to address their key international relations question: why do wars persist? Its emphasis on the causes of violent conflict makes realism a theory which is relatively narrow. It appears to ignore the fundamentals defined by the English school and liberal institutionalism for peace and justice. Rather, it highlights the origins of armed conflict on the international stage. This limits the ability of realism to examine peaceful international societies, but makes it a prime candidate for anyone who wants to understand the continuing importance of war to IR. This was especially relevant during the Cold War, when realism was the primary guide for U.S. foreign policy. Organizing principles of realism. The English school and liberal institutionalism focus on the international institutions and regimes that offer a certain degree of order to the anarchic international societies we live in. Realism, born in the wake of World War II and the dawn of the Cold War, focuses on a very different range of questions. In IR, the most important fact for realists is the presence of an anarchic international system inhabited by sovereign states. Subtly different from the English school championed international society, an international system. While international society recognizes the importance of norms, rules, and practices in shaping the behavior of actors, an international system is merely a set of pursuing power interacting states to ensure their survival. While some states in the system may find it convenient in the short term to follow shared sets of rules, realists argue that states will break those laws as soon as they are no longer convenient for the pursuit of power by the state. After all, there is no global government capable of forcing states to follow international law conventions. It separates IR from domestic politics, where centralized judiciaries and police enforce land law. Rather of a global government, the relative power of its constituent states gives shape to the international system of realism. The anarchic international system model of realism helps explain the persistence of war, defined as large-scale organized violence between two or more international actors pursuing political ends. By simplifying the world, it does so, highlighting only those actors and interactions that contribute to its explanation of the international conflict. Realism is like a simple roadmap between 2 points in the journey. Realism has a hard time analyzing the causes of peace and cooperation phenomena as important as war in international relations history. Realism was arguably the most influential philosophy of IR for a long time. It is a great help in trying to understand how wars begin and how they can be fought effectively. This made it especially popular in the US. In the second half of the 20th century, when the United States and the Soviet Union were in a more or less permanent state of war from around 1948 to around 1991. Organizing principal key ideas. 1. Realist philosophy first gained prominence in the United States at the conclusion of World War II and attempts to explain the historic nature of war. 2. Realism's guiding principle is the anarchic international system, a set of sovereign states whose actions are restricted only by power, rather than institutions of English school or liberal regimes. 3. Realism provides a highly simplified model of international behavior, discussing the nature of conflict while not covering many other facets of the IR. Concepts and assumptions. Throughout this topic, you will be introduced to two major realist conceptual models: classical realism and structural realism. They share a set of beliefs about the world in which we live. First, in IR, they all accept the statism as a fundamental fact. Realism's organizing principle is rooted in the reason for this one-minded emphasis on state actors. Non-state actors lack the military capacity to threaten state actors, and are therefore dependent on their home state for security within the anarchic international system. Statism separates realism from the pluralistic IR paradigm suggested by the English school, and helps define the realist approach to IR understanding. Second, on the international level, realists of all types recognize survival as the main objective of any state. Realists emphasize the anarchic nature of the international system. The English school and liberal institutionalism both accept that there is no supreme ruler or judge capable of resolving international disputes. While these hypotheses, however, recognize institutions and regimes as possible sources of order and justice, realism maintains that only power in the international system can guarantee the survival of a state. All other goals have to be subordinated to the quest for survival, even though that means turning one's back on an ally or violating a key aspect of international law. Third, all realists agree that states can only ensure their own survival through strategies of self-help that allow them to defend themselves and their interests against the aggression of another state. They reject the liberal idea of a harmony of interests shared by all international actors and question the long-term sustainability of alliances. History is a riddled, after all, with examples of allies turning on each other as soon as the threat unifying them is gone. This is exactly what occurred at the end of the Second World War, when, after the threat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, the United States and Great Britain were split from the Soviet Union. This experience profoundly affected early thinkers of realism, leading them to believe that there was no lasting alliance and that each state had to look to its own power for a true guarantee of its survival in an anarchic world. Classical realism. Classical realism was the first branch of realist philosophy to emerge following World War II ended. Starting with Hans Morgenthau's work, it argues that states are pursuing power and security at the expense of one another. Following in the footsteps of Thomas Hobbes, who argues that, unless controlled by some form of dominant ruler or government, human beings are aggressive by nature, classical realists believe that human nature holds the key to understanding war and conflict. Morgenthau and Hobbes believe human beings are aggressive by nature in a state of nature. Therefore, human life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutal and short in the absence of a government to control our aggressive impulses. Classical realists use Hobbesian human nature to describe our anarchic international system of international relations. They conclude on this basis that war is a natural product of an aggressive human nature operating in an ungoverned and therefore insecure international environment. Each state must rely on its own power in the international system to defend itself against every other state. Given these assumptions, classical realists have no trouble explaining the persistence of war at the level of the individual human being attributed to aggressive nature. Structural realism. Structural realism, originating in the 1970s, draws many of the same conclusions as to its classical predecessor. It does so, however, by looking at systemic causes rather than individual ones. This means that it focuses less on human nature and more on the international system's anarchic structure in which states operate. Kenneth Waltz, whose 1979 book Theory of International Politics provides the foundation for the explanations of war and IR through structural realism, stresses the contrast between his approach and that of Morgenthau and the classical realists. While classical realism puts responsibility for war at the feet of individual human beings, Waltz points to the international system's anarchical structure as the primary reason for the persistence of war. He believes states are victims of the security dilemma, in which efforts of one state to ensure its survival threaten the security of states around it. Following realism's concept of self-help, Waltz claims that in an anarchic international system the only rational course of action for a state is to preserve enough military and political power to defend itself from aggression. In doing so, it might invest in new arms or seek alliances with other states in a crisis. Unfortunately, these self-defense moves would tend to challenge neighboring countries, prompting them to respond with their own military buildup and alliance building. In a world defined by mutual distrust, attempts by one state to protect its survival will make other states less secure, forcing them to respond with their own strategies for self-help. The result is an arms race where each state builds its military capacity in response to the actions of one another. This is the crux of the security dilemma which structural realists use to describe the persistence of international conflict and war. Without a world government, states are doomed to live in an environment of mutual distrust, and the declaration of one state that it is seeking military power for purely defensive purposes is certain to be met with suspicion by its neighbors. Now comparing and contrasting the three theoretical approaches to IR. At several points, they agree. First, everybody accepts that international relations are occurring in an anarchic international environment. Finally, each hypothesis sees the international arena as inhabited by collective actors, groups of individuals with the potential to a. Reproduce themselves over time and b. be treated as actors for analysis purposes. Realism, with its exclusive emphasis on states, has the most restricted definition of what international actors can be viewed as. Liberal institutionalism has a broader understanding, with states, NGOs, and TNCs all playing roles in their international regimes and organizations. Between these extremes, the English school, which recognizes international societies rather than international systems, disappears. Some international societies resemble the competitive and combative IR model of realism, particularly when institutions are defined in practices such as war and militarism. Realism and the First World War. Although realism emerged after 1945 as a theory of international relations, its emphasis on the causes of war makes it a useful tool to understand the origins of World War I. The following section analyzes the origins of the conflict utilizing three realist concepts: power, survival, and the security dilemma. Power is a central element in both structural and classical realism. Because realism rejects the importance of English school institutions and liberal regimes, a central role in shaping international relations is the distribution of power among the states of the anarchic international system. Power distribution within the international system can be described using the polarity language. Polarity describes how many great powers an international society or system has in position. These great powers are the actors most capable of defending themselves by pure self-help, building up their own military power to deter attacks from other great powers. Realists also ignore small powers in the international system, because they lack the ability to protect their own interests. Instead, they need to bandwagon with one or more great powers, hoping their alliance will dissuade other actors from threatening their survival. The balance of power: all of these states pursues their interests. This required access to sufficient power to deter any state or group of states that hoped to become hegemonic within the system. The great powers sought to achieve a secure balance of power by a combination of internal balance, building up their own power by investments in their armies and navies, and external balance, negotiating treaties with other states to form alliances that would deter states from attacking them. Europe was divided into two opposing alliances by 1914. The Triple Alliance spread across Europe's center and included Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Germany was by far the most powerful of these states and thus played a central role in the decision-making process for the entire alliance. The United Kingdom, France, and Russia formed the Triple Entente. While the UK was the most powerful of these states. Due to their particular strengths, each member of the Triple Entente held their own authority. The UK was still the #1 naval and imperial power in the world. However, according to European standards, it had a very small army and was thus less dominant on the European continent than one would expect. Then, Russia had an immense army. It could put millions of soldiers into the field and have manpower resources well beyond any state other than the USA. The linchpin of the Entente was France. Apart from a respectable overseas empire, it possessed an army almost equal in size of Germany. More specifically, its alliance with Russia and the United Kingdom meant forcing the Triple Alliance to battle any war on two fronts, a western front facing France and an eastern front facing Russia. The non-European great powers, meanwhile, either aligned with one of the two alliances, as Japan did through its alliance with the United Kingdom, or sought a course of isolation from European conflicts, as the United States and the Ottoman Empire unsuccessfully tried to do. The history of events that led to the First World War is well known and need not be outlined in great detail here. However, we should examine how the security dilemma at the core of structural realism may relate to our understanding of these events. Thus, in the first decade of the 1900s, when Germany began to build a large number of powerfully armed and armored battleships, the United Kingdom was forced to respond with its own building program. German shipbuilding's declared objective was simply to protect German trade and help monitor the oceans of the world. The United Kingdom, however, had no way of knowing whether Germany wanted to challenge its overseas empire or its home islands. Therefore, the security dilemma ignited the Anglo-German naval race of the early 20th century, causing tensions between London and Berlin at a time when their economies were more interconnected and their royal families were closely connected by blood ties. The same can be said of the events which precipitated the war in 1914. Following the assassination by a Serbian nationalist of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary sent an ultimatum to Serbia demanding an Austria-led investigation of Serbia's complicity in the murder. Since Serbia, faced with apparent Austrian aggression, had to secure its survival, it turned to its great ally of power, Russia. Mutual mistrust between Austria and Serbia has contributed to the involvement of Russia in the crisis. This precipitated a Russian military mobilization against Austria-Hungary, supposedly defending Serbia. In view of the mutual mistrust generated by the security dilemma, this prompted Germany to begin its own, supposedly defending German territory, mobilization, forcing France to do the same to prevent a German attack. This domino effect has been made possible by the threatening environment created by the security dilemma, in which one actor's actions compel others to do likewise. Without it, it would be difficult to completely understand the causes of the First World War. Key points: Realism and the First World War. 1. Structural realism shows us that the First World War began thanks to the security dilemma. 2. To balance one another, Europe's great powers developed a pair of opposing alliances intended to prevent war, which simply made it easier for conflict to spread through every corner of the continent from the borders of Serbia and Austria-Hungary. Conclusion of the topic. Realism is one of the dominant philosophical traditions of IR and primarily focuses on theories of conflict and war within the international system. These similar units compete for survival in an anarchic international system, driven either by their Hobbesian human natures, classical realism, or by the anarchic structure of the system itself, structural realism, into self-help practices. While primarily focused on conflict and war, realism has had a significant impact on IR and remains a foundation of the understanding of the world politics. What we learned so far. 1. Define and explore key concepts and terminology related to realism. 2. Describe the security dilemma as a cause of interstate conflict. 3. Contrast realist IR theories with English school theories and liberal institutionalism. 4. Using realist concepts to explain the reasons behind the First World War. Key questions related to realism. 1. How does classical and structural realism describe the persistence of conflict between states? 2. Is the anarchic international system ever going to create a sustainable peace according to realism? List of core concepts of realism. Power, international system, war, statism, survival, self-help, human nature, security dilemma. Next topic: Marxism. Thanks for watching.